Welcome back to Unveiling the Covenants. We are going through the story of salvation history, and we are opening up the story of the Exodus, chapter 3 now. This is that great burning bush incident. We're going to talk about some of the imagery here and some of the historical realities behind what we are seeing in the narrative. Chapter 3 starts with Moses keeping the flock of his father-in-law. Jethro, whom we've talked about, has the name Reuel as well. He's a priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush, and look, and behold, the bush was burning, and yet it was not consumed. I want to just tangentially talk about this. This is what's called a theophania, the manifestation of God. In the Old Testament, a manifestation of God anywhere is called a theophany. This particular narrative takes on the element of fire to show that God's love is an all-consuming fire for the sake of his people. And yet, despite being a burning flame, it doesn't burn up. It doesn't consume, which is a key component. It speaks about the presence of the Spirit within us that while living within us, burning within us, doesn't burn us up. There's a cooperation between our will and the work of the Spirit within us. It's one. But the church fathers, especially Gregory of Nyssa, spoke about how, in his Life of Moses, spoke about how the burning bush also becomes an allegory to Mary, who within her virginal womb conceived the burning reality of the divine and human nature of Christ in her womb. And yet at the same time, she, her body, her personhood, her virginity were not consumed by that divine reality. So we're looking here as the burning bush manifests a kind of foreshadowing to the messianic manifestation. In the case of the burning bush of Moses, Moses becomes the Messiah of Egypt, the messianic representation for Israel. In the New Testament, Jesus becomes the Messiah. So, as I've mentioned before, when you look at Moses, think to Jesus very often. Now, going back to this, the angel of the Lord appeared, and Moses said, I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. The other thing I want to point out is linguistically, I don't want to overplay this hand, but linguistically, that word for bush could also have meant a wide brush, which means it was a vast area and not just a singular bush, even though in most depictions, artistically, we see a single bush that's burning. It might well have been a tremendous wilderness fire that Moses was witnessing, which wasn't strange in that land of Midian. What was strange, however, is he had witnessed bushes burning before that, whole swaths of bushes burning before that, but this time it wasn't being consumed. There was something different about the fire. And so Moses says, I want to see what's going on. And the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, and God called out to him out of the bushes, Moses, Moses. Again, we've got the twofold call here. It's a language of intimacy, but it also connotes a language of urgency. Moses, Moses. This is a dual recognition of the name. With that urgency and intimacy comes, therefore, the vocation and the mission. And he said, here am I. Now, there's a bit of linguistic interplay here. With Moses responding, here am I, God will say, here am I. Moses effectively says, here I am, and God says, no. Here you are, and here I am. And so I am will be where you are. Just kind of notice that linguistic interplay here. And he said, do not come near, put off your shoes from your feet, for the place which you are standing is holy ground. Two things I'd play. Because of the presence of the angel of the Lord, that ground is now hallowed for God. It's a place of theophany. Secondly, this language of taking off your sandals, the exchange of sandals, is also the language of what we call the kinsman redeemer. That typically this is how it worked. For widows and children of a man who has died, or especially for a widow who has died, without children, and if someone wants to adopt the widow, or even to adopt the whole family, one of the ways in which this would happen is there would be an exchange of sandals at a meeting place, typically the gate of a city, with the closest relative. We'll see Boaz do this with one of the closest relatives of Ruth's former husband. Don't want to get into the weeds of that now. The point I want to stress here is that the exchange of sandals, the exchange of the protection of one's feet, is to connote that from this point on, I will be your protector. I will be the one who guards your feet lest it strikes itself against a stone. So Moses taking off his sandals is a recognition of the reverence owed to holy ground, divine ground, which is wonderful, it's beautiful. But secondarily, and perhaps more importantly, there is this connotation that God is saying, not only am I redeeming you for my own, I want to use you to redeem all of my sons of Israel. But God won't speak about Israel as the sons of Israel now. He will speak of Israel corporately as his son. So the fatherhood and sonship of God now has taken on the entire nation of Israel. And he said, I am the God of your father. Again, covenant formula. I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. This was a natural response. Prior to Christ doing what he did, to behold the face of the divine was to die on the spot. I need to make this very, very clear that we don't have a right to look upon God's face, especially owing to our fallen human nature. Any privilege that we receive to look upon the face of God is gifted by Christ, not to be taken for granted. And so even as we behold Christ face to face, if you will, even though veiled in the Eucharistic presence, we don't have a right. That is a tremendous, profound privilege that we have been gifted. Short of that gifted privilege of Christ paying the debt owed by sin and tearing open the veil, you and I would die every time we encountered the divine presence if there was so much as an ounce of sin on our souls, which we saw happen frequently, and the ancients understood this, and that's why Moses is doing this. And the Lord said, I've seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, but this language of seen is not just I see. That language of seen here, as I've mentioned, is I've looked into the heart of, I've seen the interiority of my people. They have cried out to me. From the depths they have cried out to me, which the Psalms will take up as a theme in exile when it talks about the soul being in exile. That from the depths we cry out to you, O Lord. De profundus clamavit. From the depths we cry out to you. And have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering. This language, I know their suffering, doesn't just mean I see, I recognize it. It's also a future allusion that what Israel is befalling now, in terms of physical suffering, but also in terms of interior suffering of sin, Christ will come into the fore. He will come into human stage and into human history, and he will take on human suffering. He will take on the weight of human sin. And so God, who says, I know their suffering, will in fact truly know our suffering. So there's a lot that's prophetic here that's going on. I've come down to deliver them. You could see this, quite frankly, as the words of Christ speaking to his apostles. I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and that also, as I've mentioned before, in scriptural analogy, can also mean sin. And to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of, now I want to pause there before we talk about the nations that are there. A land that overflows with milk and honey, which we will see throughout the scriptures, was a common description in the Near East. And it has to do historically with a lot of conditions that were necessary for flourishing. And if those conditions are met, then there's a lot of affluence that's taking place, including farming grain and wheat, and all of the regular yields, including barley, that the Israelite people would regularly consume of, that all of those were being met. The cattle were regularly meeting their nutritional needs. The bees were being met with their nutritional needs. And so Israel was just lavishing in abundance. That's the language of flowing with milk and honey. It therefore becomes an allusion in the scriptures pointing forward. It's typology and anti-type. Typology that points forward to ultimately the glory of heaven and the lack thereof of what they experience in Egypt, which is in sin. Sin robs us of the experience of the land flowing with milk and honey. So when you see this allusion to the promised land, the land of milk and honey, think of heaven, even though right now it is also speaking rightly of a geographic region of land. Now, to the land of the Canaanites. The Canaanites are all those people descended of Ham and therefore descended of Canaan, the child of Ham. These are the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. We have historical records. Within the scriptures, they alluded at different points. But within the extra-canonical Jewish texts and rabbinic teachings, midrashim including, what we see is that there were 10 nations living in that area of the land of the Canaanites. These were the kingdoms of the Canaanites. And all of them are occupying land that they know does not belong to them, because Abraham has already made a covenantal legal claim upon that land. And so they know they are on borrowed time and on borrowed land. And this land will have to be given back. When we look at Joshua going forward, I will talk in greater depth about the history behind this. But what the Hebrew tradition shows us is that historically, these nations heard the clarion call of Joshua leading the Israelites, and of the nations, most of them evacuated the land because they knew that they had no right to be there, and that the Israelites had a right to be there and had the military might of conquest. One nation apparently entered into covenant with Israel, and so became subsumed into covenant life. The other nation, the final one, stayed there, insisting on fighting the Israelites. That was the nation that got slaughtered. That was the nation that got decimated. They knew they were fighting a losing battle. It was just a complete reluctance on their part. So there really is a kind of ordained justice, if you will, to what happened, but that's jumping too far forward. I want to go right back to this. And now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me, and I've seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring forth my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses then said to God, now this will begin a certain pattern of people who, called by God, try to resist the divine call. Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? This is a recognition of Moses' stature. He's recognized as a murderer. He knows he doesn't deserve God's call. He is rather happy where he is, because when he escaped Egypt, he was 40 years old. He has lived in the land of Midian for a further 40. He's 80 years old. Now, when you see 40, I've mentioned this in previous episodes, when you see 40, think of a time of divine preparation. God prepared Moses in terms of the best schooling possible administratively for 40 years, so that in the next 40 years of his life in Midian, he grew in different kinds of skills, including cattle herding, including the administration of a small tribe, caring for the people. But I also believe that what was going on is, being married to the daughter of a priest, Jethro, Moses was being immersed in the sacrificial liturgical tradition that he couldn't practice in the 40 years he had in Egypt. This is going to be crucial, because that sacrificial cult, that liturgical immersion, is something that the Israelites are not practicing while they're in Egypt. They've been ostracized by the Egyptians to live in Goshen, to be sure. But the Israelites are not offering liturgical sacrifice constantly, because the Egyptians would consider that abhorrent. Moses now has had 40 years of worshiping the Lord rightly by means of liturgical sacrifice. This is going to be a major component of the call of the Israelites out of Egypt, and what Moses will enact in the lives of the Israelites. I have sent you. I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought forth the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain. I want to touch on that word serve for a minute. I've mentioned before that word avad, abad, abod. It's difficult to simply say serve. It's also the word for slavery. It's the word for service, but it's also the word for worship. So the Israelites, not offering liturgical avad, abod, to God, were now bound in avad to Pharaoh. They were bound to service to Pharaoh, avad, in slavery, avad. So when we don't avad the Lord, we are bound by our own avad service to a life of avad slavery. But in avad serving the Lord, worshiping the Lord, we are broken from the yoke of servile avad, and therefore set free from a life of avad, slavery. It's a unique word, and I actually love that linguistic interplay that the Hebrew scriptures have. Moses said to God, if I come to the sons of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask him, what is his name? What shall I say to them? Now, you might wonder, well, why does that even matter? He's already identified himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And as I've mentioned before, it's a covenant formula. It's evoking not just the faithfulness of Moses' forefathers in saying yes to God, it's also evoking the faithfulness of God to the promises he gave to Israel and to Isaac and to Abraham before that. And what God is saying is, if I was faithful to them, do you not think I will be faithful to you now? I am that same God who's calling you. They've never had to worry about God's name before. Why worry now? Well, first to understand that, you have to think about Moses' upbringing. The first 40 years of his life, after his weaning, so really we're looking at 38 years of his life. The first 38 years of his life, what kind of religious cult did he see going on in Egypt? A polytheistic, pagan, utilitarian, transactional religion. It was a religious cultic service and system of transaction. Offer this thing to this idol for this purpose, and this idol gives you this in return. Every one of those idols had a name. Every one of those idols had a dominion, an area of dominion. Very often, multiple idols occupied the dominion of a certain area. We will talk about that when we talk about the plagues that are befalling Egypt. But this is what I want to talk about here. What is his name? What shall I say to them? God actually meets Moses where he's at. God gives him the answer he's hoping for. God said to Moses, I am who I am. There's a lot that goes into this name. It's so easy for us to say, well, yeah, God said, I am who I am. And so in the Hebrew, this shows up as the 4 letters, Yod, He, Vav, and He. And you sort of wonder, what on earth is this? It's a depiction of God saying, Eyad, Asher, Ehad, Eyad, I am, I is, I was, I is, I will be. Linguistically, it's difficult to translate, so much so that St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theology, it's in the Prima Pars, I think it's in question 13, article 11, where he starts talking about how this is a philosophical reality as much as theological. God is effectively saying that he is the fullness of being itself. It's not that he exists. He's not just one God amongst many in a pantheon of gods. He is God above all. He is God itself. And unlike the Egyptian concept where there's an ethereal ancestral plane and you are weighed by scales, and there is a kind of hell, there is a kind of pleasant afterlife, but you're subservient to different gods for different purposes. It's a weird system, which is typical of every weird pagan religious system. God is saying to Moses right now, I'm not even bound by those categories. I am the prime category. I am being itself. I is who is. I am isness. I am the fullness of my own substance. I am the divine nature. And what God is saying, therefore, is the entire created order doesn't contain God because God is outside of creation, having created creation, and all creation is held in being by God. God actively holds in being creation. Creation, in essence, borrows its being, its essence, from God, who is existence itself. And Moses, having been schooled in the best that Egypt had to offer, understood these categories to whatever limitation that the time had in terms of the natural sciences. And he recognized the superiority of God's claim over any of the idols of Egypt that he had been raised to learn about. And so Moses understood what was going on here. I am who I am. And this philosophical declaration also means this: who was, who is, and who forever will be is coming to Moses right now. The Egyptian idols, in theory, could be defeated and killed, even though they're gods. They were, as all pagan systems, they were to be seen as elevated, capricious human beings at times. They were, as I mentioned, capricious. They were sporadic. They were voluntaristic at times. Some of them had unfettered passions. It wasn't nobility and virtue that marked the Egyptian cultic system. With God, however, the fullness of truth, the fullness of goodness, the fullness of morality, the fullness of beauty, the fullness of aesthetics, the fullness of revelation, all of this finds its perfection in God, who is the fullness of being. All things come from him, all things go back to him. This is a claim that's profoundly philosophical and theological. We could spend entire classes just doing I am who I am. But I want to go back to the narrative here. And God said, say this to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers. And now we're getting somewhere in terms of covenant responsibility, because on the one hand, God is elevated prime being. He is the fullness of being itself. But at the same time, he is intimate in covenant. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, invoking that covenantal language and formula again, has sent me to you. And this is my name forever. Thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together, the heads of the tribes of Israel, and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I've observed you. Again, that language of I've seen your suffering. I promise I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt and take you to that land flowing with milk and honey. And they will, now God says this, they will listen to your voice. You and the elders of Israel will then go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. And now we beg you, this is crucial. Let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Now, there's a practical reality. You can't offer blood sacrifice to another god within Egypt. It's an affront to the Egyptian ritual, the Egyptian system of worship. But secondarily, the 3 days is, again, Christ representation. 3 days was the Hebrew understanding of true death. The Israelites were called to go 3 days into the wilderness, 3 days into their own death. But why? Why does God want them to die? He wants them to die of the bad habits they had received from Egypt, including the lack of their true, faithful liturgical worship. A large part not due to their own fault. It's because they're trapped in Egypt. But God wants them to enter into death so that they can rise to new life by means of a sacrificial liturgy to God, commune with God, and receive again the grace of covenant adoption, renew their covenant with Him, and be blessed by Him, protected by Him, and liberated by Him. Why? Because we are set free from the bondage of slavery by means of entry into death with Christ and liturgical worship and sacrifice into our liberation, into the joys of a land flowing with milk and honey, eternal life. That's what's going on in that language here. And the Israelites understood this. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders which I will do in it. After that, God says, He will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. All of this will come to pass, but Moses will have to grapple. And so his faith is going to be tested time and time again by God throughout this whole thing. But Moses will ultimately prevail because one of the things he will say to God is that he is a person slow of speech and therefore he doesn't want to do this. And God will work so powerfully in Moses that by the end of Moses' life, the last book of the Bible, the book of Deuteronomy, as Moses says, he is a man who's slow to speech or doesn't speak well. Some oral tradition holds he might have had a stutter, or he wasn't an eloquent speaker, or another theory could have been that he had forgotten how to speak fluent Egyptian because 40 years away from Egypt tends to do that to you. Regardless of the situation, what we do know is God will work so powerfully in Moses that this man who claims to be slow of speech will then single-handedly deliver 3 long homilies at the end of his life that will be so prominent, prophetic, and powerful and profound in the lives of Israel that they will record it into a book. We will call that the book of Deuteronomy, quite literally the second law, how the Israelites ought to live now that they've been laicized from the priesthood that was actually theirs, but they had betrayed God by means of the golden calf incident. We won't go that far yet, but I do want to round this off. I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians will actually bless the Israelites as they're leaving. And when you go, you shall not be empty. True enough. Each woman shall ask of her neighbor and of her who sojourns in her house jewelry of silver and gold and clothing. And you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, and thus you shall despoil the Egyptians. Now, I want to make clear here, there's a lot that's going on historically. The language is, again, let us go forth 3 days into offering blood sacrifice, offering liturgical sacrifice, engage again in ritual worship. But God is also saying this: as you leave, the riches of those whom you have slavishly served will now be given to you. As you leave, all those who have received from you unjustly will now turn back and bless you. You will, in fact, look at the language here. You will despoil the Egyptians. And so the slavery of the Israelites will not be counted for nothing. They will actually leave with significant wealth. They will leave with jewelry. And what this simply means is God is giving them the avenues necessary, but also the blessing of wealth. Because let's face it, precious metals in the wilderness don't really account for much in terms of barter trading. The life that they will be set to live in the wilderness will not look like the life they had in Goshen. Because as I mentioned before, Goshen is a river delta territory. Anything you plant there grows and grows well. And the Israelites had gotten used to it. In fact, during the exile, you start talking about the melons that we had, the fruits that we had, the fish that we had. You've come here, brought us here to die, because apparently all you need to do is feed people and they will willingly embrace slavery. And before you say, that sounds silly, give me liberty or give me death, that's you and I. In fact, the progressivist culture today manifests this. If you keep people well fed, you can enslave them into any self-destructive ideology. And therein lies the issue. That's how socialism and communism have triumphed throughout human history, ultimately leading to the demise of entire cultures, societies, and nations. We have to stop and fight back in terms of truth. And so when we look back at the Exodus narrative, it also is a communication of what sin does to us. That if we are well fed on the pleasures of sin, we willingly bind ourselves to the slavery, the yoke of slavery that we impose upon ourselves. What God is saying now is, I will despoil even those forces that have enslaved you. But the cost is going to be dear. 3 days into the wilderness will turn into 40 years in the wilderness, because the 3 days represents a symbol of dying to self. And when 3 days wasn't enough, God expanded it to 40 years. If you and I die to self and choose to avad God, He will break the yoke of avad service from the chains of avad slavery that we have bound ourselves in, so that He can set us truly free to truly avad Him. And that's the lesson we learn from the burning bush incident. When we go off from there, we're going to start seeing the great drama unfold between Moses and the Israelites and Moses and Pharaoh. He will fight a fight on 2 counts. The Israelites will have issues with him. Pharaoh will have issues with him. God will triumph. And the people of Israel will experience liberty from practical slavery. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, I'm Marcus Peter.